Truthfully now, who knew that rangers existed outside of Texas? Anyone? I didn't. So when I found out during the course of my research for my book, Her Queen City Ranger, that my home state of Colorado actually did have and does have its own rangers, of course I had to include them. And that is what we're talking about today. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Emily Harris, author of STEAMY Historical Romances, and today I am sharing one of the more fun tidbits from my research excursions from my first book, Her Queen City Ranger. And at the time when I was writing this book, or when I was developing the idea for the story, I knew that I needed some sort of a law enforcement officer as my main character if I wanted to use the idea of a kidnapped heroine on the run in the American West. So in my initial thoughts on this, I thought, well, what did Colorado have at the time? Colorado wasn't even a thing yet in the mid-1800s. It was by that point in my book, but I didn't even have the timeline set in stone yet. So all of that still had to be worked out. And at the time, I believe I was reading True Grit, which is a very interesting book aside from it's a great read, but I found it interesting for its lack of contractions in the way it's written. So there's a side note on that. I need to take note of all of these things I keep promising to make videos on, because I don't know if I'll remember them all. I have to go back and see. But at any rate, I was reading True Grit, and I believe that was also round about the time when the more recent movie came out in, I don't remember the year, but it was the one with Matt Damon as the Texas Ranger. And because of that, I thought, well, that movie and the book had a marshal, a U.S. Marshal, and it had a Texas Ranger. Well, obviously I don't need a Texas Ranger in a Colorado book. My first thought was maybe a marshal, because depending on the era, Colorado may or may not have had its own police force yet. So I was looking into marshals and what exactly their jurisdiction is, what all they do, and that sort of thing. And somehow, by chance, I came across information about Colorado Rangers. I must have been looking up marshals in conjunction with the Rangers, the Texas Rangers, I'm pretty sure, because otherwise I don't know why it would have come up. But I found out that Colorado Rangers were a thing. So that, to me, was massively interesting, so I had to use that in order to give myself an excuse for continuing to research this police force in Colorado. And here's what I found out. Now, back in the 1850s, specifically late 1850s, 1858 to 1861, was the time of population boom in what is now Denver, and a little bit further south toward Colorado Springs, we had our Pikes Peak Gold Rush, and that is basically what put Colorado on the map. At the time, it was not yet Colorado, it was the Jefferson Territory, and it was your typical Wild West boomtown. You had about 50 some odd brothels and bars, and maybe a church, and a bunch of tents that acted as the miners' living quarters. Also, very much like your typical Wild West story, that meant that there was not a whole lot of law enforcement in the area, and that was a problem. So, the first Colorado statewide law enforcement organization that came about were these rangers who were actually first called the Jefferson Rangers, and they were incorporated, or they were created in 1861 specifically to keep the peace in the territory. And excuse me, I already need to make a correction from my notes. They began as the Jefferson Rangers, and then in 1861, when Colorado became, or when Jefferson Territory became the Colorado Territory, then they became Colorado Rangers. All right, so that's the timeline there, 1861. And they would remain Colorado's only statewide law enforcement agency through the 1920s. They also served as Colorado's state militia. So we can see them called upon at certain times. For example, the Civil War. During the Civil War, we don't often think of the West as having had anything to do with the Civil War, but in actuality, there were some conflicts that happened this far west. One of the major ones was the Battle of Glorieta Pass here in Colorado, and that some have named, or that has been named, as the Gettysburg of the West. It was a major decisive battle for the Union, and the point of it was to protect the Colorado gold fields, because whoever controlled those fields obviously would have access to more funding. And the Colorado Rangers played a major part in protecting that area, that Glorieta Pass. So they became known during that time. Now, after the war, they went back to their state law enforcement duties, and they would also be called up by state governors from time to time to act in a way that is similar to what we hear of today when the governor calls in the National Guard. So things like civil unrest, things like natural disasters, it was the Colorado Rangers that were called in to help with that. Now, this could be a good thing, this could be a bad thing. It proved to be a little of both for the Rangers. In 1922, the Rangers were instrumental in helping to basically bust the biggest criminal gang in Denver at the time, and ended up rounding up 33 suspects of this gang in a single day, and so that was a major good thing, right? However, by this time in the 20s, public opinion of the Rangers was kind of steadily decreasing. For one thing, there were other law enforcement agencies at the time. The Rangers were not the be-all, end-all. Additionally, because they could be called in by the governors, depending on the governor, not everyone agreed with what the Rangers were used for, and therefore that gave the Rangers a bad rap if the governor made a poor decision. So an example of that would be 1927. There was the Columbine Mine Massacre, or what would be called the Columbine Mine Massacre. And this was a time when the miners at this particular mine, or in this area, went on strike. This was not new. Miners had been going on strike for a long time, and conflicts had happened for a long time due to miners trying to assert their rights, or their right to have rights against the big mining corporations. This was one of those times. The miners were on strike. The governor, or might not have been the governor, but the powers that be in the mining company, whoever had access to the Rangers, they were called in, and eventually a shootout started. Many innocent people died. There were miners, women, children, and the big horror of this massacre was it was reported that the Rangers had been using machine guns to fire into the crowd of miners. The Rangers denied this, but of course their involvement in this massacre did not help their standing with the public, and Also in that year, they would end up being disbanded. So 1927, the Rangers were disbanded, and this also came in the wake of having lost their funding in 1923. So things were just kind of steadily decreasing for the Rangers anyway, and then 1927. The Rangers would make a comeback later on in the 1940s, 1941. The Rangers were reorganized as an all-volunteer mounted law enforcement organization. And they would go through, then from that point on, they would go through a couple of different reorganizations. However, this main idea of mounted law enforcement volunteers who are kind of a backup for the current police forces in Colorado has maintained. They are still a volunteer organization to this day, and they are now a nonprofit. So there you have it. The Colorado Rangers, brief history. Unfortunately, I want to say that whatever I found as part of my research back in the day, and of course at the time I wasn't keeping good notes. I don't know that I keep much better notes these days, but I want to say I had more information then than what I was able to find now on this topic of the Rangers. But either way, I found it very interesting. It is a unique part of Colorado history, and it's always great when I learn something new. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing if you like this kind of historical background to writing research. And until next time, everyone, happy reading.